The storm was a living engine, and it wanted to grind the world flat. Snow came sideways in glittering knives. Wind climbed the ice crawler's chassis and rattled every bolt, as if testing which would quit first. Merrick Vale kept 2 fingers on the wheel and 1 eye on the failing telemetry, while the other eye did what you did on Deathworlds, looked for shapes that weren't supposed to move. That was when the song found him. It came up through the steering column, a tremor of sound so low it felt like the ghost of a warmth he'd forgotten, a steady, sorrowing hum that didn't match any warning tone he'd ever logged. The crawler's panel translated the vibration into a ragged waveform. His gut translated it into one word: lullaby. He cut speed, letting the treads chew slow and sure, and fed another handful of curses into the heater that had started acting proud again. On the external cams, the world was nothing but roiling white. Then a darker seam opened like a knife slid in, fabric the mouth of a crevasse smothered with new snow. The map called the area a null return. He'd salvaged enough wrecked icecraft to know why. You marked places like this and drove on. Only the song didn't let him. It threaded the chassis again. 3 short pulses nested inside one long. The cadence of a tired heart, counting smaller, faster hearts under it. He remembered, without warning, the way an old plasma drill had sounded the day he'd found a trapped miner beneath the catwalk's metal screaming one note, the human inside singing another, because that's what humans and some miracles do when they refuse to end. Merrick anchored the crawler to an ice pin, clipped his harness, and tested the magline until it hummed. The storm shoved him in the back like a rude friend. He grabbed the tote with a radiant lamp, 2 thermal sheets, a coil of smart rope, and the last full med gel he owned, a cherry-scented oddity from a planetary clinic that had gone bankrupt before it ever learned its own hours. He wasn't thinking about raiders or profit margins or the number of repair jobs he'd have to barter to cover what he was about to spend. He was thinking about an impossible lullaby leaking through kilometers of bad weather. "All right," he told the storm. "Hold that thought." He stepped into the cut in the world. The light fell away in a blue collapse. Frost tried to write its name on his visor while the walls swept past in slick planes, ancient ice with centuries frozen inside like rumors in glass. Far below, the sound strengthened, still a lullaby, but frayed the way a voice gets when it has sung through fear and past anger into the exhausted, tender part that exists only for children. Merrick found a ledge that pretended to be an idea of safety and paused there, letting the mag clamps breathe, letting his breath slow until his visor stopped fogging. The lamp threw a honeycircle over the ice. It wasn't much. It was everything. He edged along the ledge, feeling the stone-skinned silence of the crevasse become something else, listening, answering. He felt the moment the lullaby noticed him. The pitch wavered. A warning chord slid under the comfort. And then the notes steadied again, as if the singer had decided that whatever approached was not yet. The worst thing that had happened today. He rounded a buttress and saw them. The mother dragon lay like a collapsed constellation, wings half-curled, scales filmed in rime that turned her black and bronze, hide the color of starlight through frost. Under her breast, 3 small shapes trembled in a close knit of tails and limbs. A membrane along one wing was torn. The edges had gone. The pale color of cold that lasts too long. Her eyes opened. Old gold behind the glaze. The lullaby gentled. Merrick holstered the bolt driver. He lifted the radiant lamp instead, nursing its warmth higher, until the air between them shimmered like a promise. "I can't fix the weather," he said, voice tinny in his own ears. "But I can fix heaters." The mother's pupils narrowed, then widened again. Her head lowered a finger's width. For the first time since the storm began, Merrick's hands stopped shaking. Trust, on a world like this, is built from physics and patience. He kept his movements slow and squared to the mother's gaze, letting her see his hands, letting her decide the distance. The radiant lamp he set down 3 steps ahead, angled toward her chest so the warmth reached the shivering knot beneath without forcing it. The thermal sheets he unfolded with quick shakes and slid across the ice in small offerings, not advancing, not pressuring, simply adding degrees to a room that had forgotten how to be one. The lullaby shifted in timbre, warning chords dissolving back into that rocking pulse, a metronome set to hope. Up close, the damage told its own hard story. Windburn pitted the scales along the leading edges of her wings. The tear through the Right membrane was scalloped, not clean, ripped by ice, then frozen, then ripped again. Frostbite had climbed the veins like climbing rope. He unspooled a slender wand and drew a circle of dim red around the wounded stretch. The medgel would need warmth to take, and he would need her permission to get that close. He tapped his chest twice with gloved fingers, then placed the same 2 taps on the ice near the wound and waited. The mother dragon watched the gesture, watched him not move, and in that endless whistling pause, he heard a softer sound under the lullaby, 3 smaller frequencies piping, the hatchlings chirping sleepily. Not quite awake, not quite gone. He tried a different kind of language. He hummed. It was a clumsy thing at first. A human chest trying to imitate the long, bell-deep resonance of a creature built like a cathedral. He matched the simplest part of her song, the rise, the settle, the quiet insistence at the end that said stay, and kept it there, a steady loop with no thread in it. The storm thrashed above them. Down here, the notes found each other. The mother's head tilted. Her throat worked once. The next breath she released did not steam as hard in the lamp's glow. She unsealed one wing by a hand's width, revealing 3 faces tucked like embers against her, a blink of liquid blue, a blink of curious green, a fierce black blink that sized up the radiant lamp as a thing that obviously wanted to be bitten. "Hey there," Merrick breathed, knowing none of them cared about the words, only the wind behind them. He slid a heat puck across the ice, then another, placing them where the wing unfurled, stopping every time the dragon's pupils tightened, counting to 3, humming, waiting for the dilation to return. The pucks flared to life, small suns pooling golden on the ice. He took the medgel, warmed it between both hands until the packet turned pliant, and looked to her again. She lowered her head until one golden eye filled his world. The lids narrowed, opened, narrowed. The lullaby deepened, a syllable unfolding inside it. He didn't understand the word, but he understood the shape. Permission wrapped in warning, wrapped in the bone-deep oath of a mother who had nothing left to trade but the breath in her chest. He answered with the same 2 taps, wound, then moved. The gel hissed as it met frost-bitten membrane. He layered it carefully along the scalloped edge, sealing cracks, massaging circulation back into stubborn channels with gloved fingers that had tuned engines in blizzards and brought heat to factories that had failed people with less patience than this. The mother did not flinch. The hatchling stirred, the fierce-eyed one he would later know, that stubborn spark as mech starting to nose toward the lamp. Merrick slid the lamp farther from the little teeth and let a 3rd heat puck take its place closer in, humming the whole time, breathing when she breathed, matching cadence, until his bones felt hollowed out and refilled by the same rhythm. Minutes stretched. The gel took. A thin blush of color returned to the membrane. The storm muttered a fresh insult at the lip of the crevasse and then sulked away. When he finally leaned back on his heels, the mother inhaled so slowly it felt like the beginning of a new season. She spoke again, not a word this time, but a braid of sounds, 3 bright threads twined inside a darker one. The lamp's casing vibrated, his chest did too. Names live in good machines and good songs. He didn't pretend to know the dragon tongue, but he honored the shape of what she gave. A name for the great heart before him that tasted like winter steel and cedar smoke. Thisara, and 3 small names nested under it like sparks cupped against wind. Merrick nodded once, because anything more would spill the heat he'd fought to build. "Thisara," he said softly, giving the sound back to her. The eye brightened. The wing eased, wider. He set the last heat puck near the hatchlings and watched tiny bellies rise and fall, a little steadier. "I'm Merrick. I can get you out of here." He glanced up at the ragged slice of gray far above them, calculated weights, anchors, angles, the reach of his winch against the greed of broken ice. "Not fast," he added, "because the truth earns its own warmth. But together." The Sarah's head lifted a fraction. The lullaby changed, not softer now, but stronger, a rhythm that had found another drum to beat in time with. Outside, the storm clawed at the edges of the world. Inside the blue-lit hollow, 4 hearts and 3 smaller ones beat to a new bargain. Breath for breath, step for step, until the sky remembered how to be kind. Merrick marked distances in numbers and in breaths. The numbers told him the span of cable he had, the safe load for the winch drum, the sheer strength of the pythons he could fire into ice that had opinions about being punctured. The breaths told him when to stop. He counted both. First came the harness. He unpacked the cargo web that had hauled engine blocks and station batteries and once a stubborn heat exchanger that had insisted on being an immovable object until he'd named it. He talked to this web the same way, low, patient, threaded with that clumsy hum he'd borrowed from Thesara while he slid it beneath her chest, feeding the straps under the folded forelimbs, drawing them out along her sides in a crisscross that would spread her weight without crushing the hatchlings. She watched every knot, pupils tightening when the web scraped too close to a small tail, easing when he lifted and reset with more care. When he was ready to cinch, he tapped twice on the ice and waited. She let him pull tight. He would not separate them. That was the rule he wrote in himself when he saw the way the hatchlings breathed with their faces pressed into her heat. So he built for togetherness a sling stitched out of thermal sheets and smart rope, nested like a satchel against Thesara's breast, clipped into the same harness points that held their mother. He lined the sling with his spare coat goodbye, coat and 2 warming pucks set to low. Kiri burrowed deep and vanished to her eyelids. Tovin tested the edge with a brave little paw, considered escape, and decided the satchel was in fact an empire worth ruling. Mech bared a mouthful of pebbly teeth at the buckle. Merrick rotated the buckle away and gave him a knot to glare at instead. Then came the anchors. He used a spread of pitons to keep the load from sawing a single groove into the ice like a promise to fail. The first pair bit cleanly. The third complained. The fourth shot a fine crack a handspan long across a blue pane and made his spine go cold. He shifted the line upslope, found denser ice, and reset the grid, adding a redundancy that was less engineering than superstition. The winch line, the good one he ran, threw a snatch block to double the lift and halve the load on the drum. The bad line he coiled nearby, ready, because any line can become the good one if the good one decides to resign. He drew a breath with Thesara. He timed the lift to her exhale. Up on the slow, he said, as if she spoke his language, which in that minute, by the feeling in his ribs, they both almost did. The winch whined. The cable woke, turned taut, then tighter. Thesara's talons unglued from the ice with a sound that felt very close to disapproval from the planet itself. The harness took the weight. The sling held. Kiri made a small pipe of a sound and went still again. A shower of frost rained down as the big body rose an arm's length. 2, then 3. Merrick's boots skidded and bit. He leaned back into the harness at his waist and became counterweight and metronome, keeping the sway gentle and predictable, making his body a pendulum that told the lift how it wanted to behave. Halfway to the mouth of the blue throat, the wall objected. A shelf that had been pretending to be structural gave up its pretense. It snapped like brittle candy, slammed the cargo net, and sent the whole geometry into a slow, nauseating spin. The hatchling squeaked. Thesara's head lashed once, before control returned like a wave pulling back from a rock. "Stay with me," he said. To her, to himself, to the bolts in the winch that had started to think about alternate career paths. Spin was the enemy. He killed it with friction and nerve. He opened his palm against the ice, as if how kindness works on machines might also apply to geology. Let the glove burn hot against the wall, feeding the spin into heat until his forearm sang with it. The snatch block scraped a roaring line. The spread anchors held, then complained. In a language of creaks, he answered by adding a third vector, slinging the bad line like a lasso to catch a spur of frozen stone and make a leash out of it. The leash took, turned the spin into a sway, and then into a motion he could predict. He counted to 3, and on 3, thumbed the winch. They climbed. Snow shoved through the upper mouth in bursts. Frost feathered his lashes. The cable hummed. Twice more the ice tried to take them back, once with a spiderweb of hairline fractures around a piton that he answered by firing a microtorch into the hole and letting the melt refreeze around a stainless wedge. once with a calving groan that filled the crevasse like a cathedral organ and made every part of him believe in gravity as a jealous god. Thessera helped when she could. She tucked forelimbs in as he signaled, narrowed her profile on the tight pinch, and once this he felt through the line, as much as Saw pressed one wingtip to the wall to kill a pendulum swing that he hadn't had the leverage to arrest in time. When the first taste of surface air found them thin, sharp, almost sweet, he realized he'd been breathing with his teeth clenched for minutes. He made himself unclench. Above, the ice crawler waited, a blocky silhouette haloed with blowing white. He had never loved its ugly lines more. The last meters stretched like lean days. Then Thessara's talons kissed deck. The sling settled. The cable sagged. He hit the emergency brake on the winch and sat down so hard his spine argued with him in a full paragraph. The storm tried to blow them all back into the hole they'd refused. He told it no with motion. He guided Thessera's bound weight toward the cargo bay, coaxing the line, angling the harness so she could roll from lift to deck without grinding the injured membrane. The hatchlings wriggled as the temperature changed, and Mech, seeing the radiant lamp up close, attempted to bite the light itself as if victory should be edible. Merrick laughed once, startled and genuine, the sound of a man discovering he had enough breath left over for joy. He got them inside. He sealed the bay. Outside, the world remained a white animal with too many teeth. Inside, he began to make a room. The cargo bay had two virtues. It was enclosed, and he knew every stubborn inch of it, like a family secret. Rust wrote cursive along the seams. The overhead heater wheezed like a pensioner climbing stairs. Fine, he preferred his miracles noisy. First, heat that stayed. He rerouted coolant loops, not for cooling but for warmth, turning the crawler's guts into a circulatory system that bled heat where he told it to. Conduits meant to keep electronics polite now snaked along the cargo bay walls and under the deck grating. He draped the thermal sheets over the sling and tucked their edges under Thessera's chest where the wind couldn't steal what he gave. The radiant lamp he set to a dull, steady glow, pointed just off the hatchlings so they felt it without deciding to marry it. He tossed a scrap of hose toward Mech as an official chew substitute and issued a formal ban on lamp eating that Mech accepted with a glare very large for such a small face. Then, power that didn't gasp. The auxiliary generator had seen better centuries. He coaxed it into this one with a fuel filter swap, a whisper of starting fluid, and an unrepeatable insult delivered with the flat of a wrench. The engine coughed, reconsidered life, and chose it. The lights steadied. The cabin thermostat ticked up one grudging degree, then another. Thessara's exhale fog thinned. Now, wounds that remembered how to heal. The medgel along her torn membrane had taken well, but it wasn't a splint. He needed structure. He wasn't at the shop. He didn't have the printer yet. So he built a first draft. He cut carbon struts from an old landing sledge runner, the Good Runner, which hurt his heart and helped hers, and laminated them with adhesive and a strip of webbing into an arc that would sit like an exoskeleton along the weak span. He showed it to her before he moved, tilting it so she could examine the edges, running his fingers along it so she could smell the work on him. She smelled it, smelled him, and flattened the wing a fraction to present the wound like a negotiations table. Piece by piece he placed the brace, cinching the webbing just enough to take load, not enough to bite. Kiri chirped approval and attempted to climb his sleeve. He let her arm braced so she couldn't fall if clumsy happened. Tovin sneezed a small steam cloud and then headbutted the rim of the sling as if protesting a lack of snacks. Which, to be fair, was a valid protest. He rummaged through his emergency kit, found a packet of nutrient slurry and a sachet of mineral salts meant for human shock, considered the biology of a creature with a furnace in its chest and a membrane for a wing, and improvised a warm broth in a flex cup. He dipped a finger, offered it. 3 curious tongues investigated in quick, polite sips that became less polite as they decided it was good. He refilled. In the way of all kitchens, the room changed when feeding began. Through it, he kept humming. Not because he thought the song was magic, though. On nights when machines lived against the odds, he'd argued with himself about that, but because the cadence helped him stay slow. The lullaby he had borrowed from Thessera had been built for endurance. It taught his hands to set tools down quietly. It taught the storm outside how to be heard and ignored at the same time. Once, when he reached for the wrong spanner, a low thrumming from Thessera's chest nudged him in the right direction. He found the correct wrench without looking, and the sound she gave after was unmistakably approval. 2 species, 1 workshop, 1 grammar of competence. The crawler complained at the weight distribution, dragging tail heavy, nosing up like a mule with opinions, so he adjusted ballast with crate stacks and 2 stubborn drums of glycol that had long ago promised to be useful someday, and, it turned out, were not liars. He shifted the machine's stance until the suspension stopped sulking. He checked seals twice, because storms love finding doors that don't know they're doors. He set the nav on a line that would keep them on the lee side of the broken hills, where the wind had fewer places to accelerate into knives. A faint voice on the comms rasped and died static that sounded like numbers trying to happen. He turned the radio down. He didn't need the weather report. He could hear it hitting the hull. He didn't need gossip about raiders. The soot streaks he'd seen on the horizon earlier were already a plan simmering in the back of his mind. What he needed was motion. He went up front, ran the pre-drive ritual, a superstition disguised as a checklist, and put his palm on the dash. "All right, old friend," he said to the crawler, to himself, to the probability curve. "We carry kings today." In the cargo bay, something rumbled as if seconding the motion. He eased the throttle open until the treads found purchase, and the present engine's tone settled into work instead of worry. They moved. Outside, the storm snarled and then sulked, as if it had lost interest in ruining this particular story. The view ahead was a shifting wall of white, with gray seams, where the hills made new weather out of old. Inside, the temperature crawled, from killing to merely unkind. Merrick glanced back through the small porthole between cab and bay. Thessera's head lay near the bulkhead. One eye, bright gold, watched him with a focus that felt like both audit and trust. The hatchlings were a tumble of small, improbable limbs and contentment. Kiri discovered the warm nook under his workbench and disappeared there with the instinct of all small beings who find a perfect corner. Tovin discovered that power cables taste wrong but interesting. Merrick slid a cover over them and substituted a length of old braided line that would willingly surrender to little teeth. Mech redeclared sovereignty over the nearest toolbox and sat on it, with the air of a general. When the first kilometer marker pinged green on the nav, Merrick realized his shoulders had relaxed. He let the heater breathe a little harder. He listened to the trio of hatchling snores, each a different tiny instrument, layered under the bigger drum of the engine and the deeper, steadier pulse from Thessera's chest. The music of the room made a promise. He repeated silently to himself until it felt like a bolt tightened to spec. Hanger, printers, proper brace, hot water, safety. And after safety, a valley he knew from a survey map, where geothermal vents wrote steam across the snow like calligraphy, where the ice didn't rule so hard. A place he'd marked as a dream and now promoted to an itinerary. He drove into the white and made the world smaller with competence. Behind him, heat pooled. Ahead, a door in the weather waited to be made. The storm loosened its jaw and showed teeth in patches instead of a continuous bite. Through the thinning veil, the horizon stopped being theory and started being a place again. And that was how Merrick saw the smears. They were not clouds, not the honest bruises weather puts on distance, but low black brushstrokes, painted by engines running rich and crews that liked their machines loud. Raider sleds. 3 at least, maybe 4, with their drivers hunched in armored cocoons that made bad men feel invincible and good men feel tired. He didn't panic. Panic burns fuel and makes geometry stupid. He shut down the crawler's active pings until the dash looked like a darkened stage and switched to passive ears, letting the hull listen for vibration instead of yelling its name at a sky that did not need introductions. He dimmed the lamps, ratcheted the radiator louvers to a sliver, and nudged the throttle just enough to coast them into a broken plain, where frost pillars stood shoulder to shoulder like the ribs of a whale shipwrecked in snow. The wind threaded those pillars and sang in flutes. It would sing louder than he did if he could make himself small enough. In the bay behind him, Thisara felt the change in his hands long before she could see the cause. Her head lifted, and a thin line of steam traced the air from her nostrils. The brace along her wing gleamed dull in the lamp glow. Each webbing strap an oath he'd made to physics and kept. The hatchlings woke in the way of children who don't know why the room is different, but know it is. Kiri, with a soft chirrup and a blink. Tovan, with a sneeze, he tried to pretend had been on purpose. Mech, with a tiny warrior's growl, aimed squarely at a world that kept moving without his permission. Merrick put a finger to the porthole in a gesture that meant quiet, even across species, then slid out of the cab into the side vestibule and into the storm. Silence work is a craft. He pulled a sled from the side rack, a low, flat pan he used for moving drums when gravity was feeling opinionated, and loaded it with the cheap lies you use when you need a better truth. 2 heat pucks he could spare, dialed to pulse instead of steady to imitate the rhythm of a struggling engine. A coil of nichrome wire, he ran from the pucks to a strip of scraped aluminum so the snow would hiss and sublimate the way a hot manifold does when impatience parks it foolishly. A canister of old glycol, he misted into the air to make a scent column the wind would carry. He set the rig on a vector dead east, away from the broken hills that hid his hangar, toward a basin full of pretty nothing. He did not just throw decoys and hope. Hope is a seasoning, not a meal. He studied the way the soot smears move spokes of a wheel tightening toward the center and plotted them against the shallow ridges under his boots. He placed the sled so the wind would cradle its heat and not shred it, then kissed his glove and pressed it briefly to the metal rim of the sled for luck he would not admit to. He tugged the release, watched the rig slither away at a fox's pace, and felt the valves in his chest reopen when it disappeared into the white. He was not done. He turned the crawler 3 degrees into the wind, a yaw so small it felt like a thought, and locked the louvers half open to vent warmth straight up instead of behind them where tracks lived. He sprayed the hull with a fine layer of churned snow, poor man's ablative to soften its signature. Snow is a liar's best friend in a world made of seeing and being seen. He set the nav to hug the leeward side of the frost pillars, taking a route that would make the wind erase him as he passed. Then he buried a buoy in an ice chimney, its antenna angled wrong on purpose, broadcasting the data equivalent of a shrug, power spikes, erratic, the exact profile of a scared amateur. He was not a scared amateur. He was a mechanic with 3 young lives and 1 great one in his cargo bay, and that meant he was a strategist. The sleds arrived like wolves that had studied maps. Their lights combed the plains, poured down creases, licked at the mouth of the pillar field without yet committing. He held still, because stillness has weight, and weight bends outcomes. The decoy sled's pulsed heat reached the raiders at the same time as the chimney beacon's idiot message, and predators always choose prey that mismanages itself. The sleds tipped east and accelerated, engines barking into the wind hard enough that he could feel their wake tremble in the pillars. He let them go. He waited 10 slow counts, then let out the breath that had whitened the inside of his mask. When he slid back into the cab, Thisara was watching through the porthole with one eye. The pupil pinched to a thread, then easing wider as she read the way his shoulders were set, and decided this new motion meant safety. The lullaby she had sung in the crevasse found a lower octave and ran along the deck plates, a sound you could set a cup of tea on without spilling. Kiri rearranged herself in the tea-mighty nook under the workbench and executed the important work of becoming a comma. Tovan gave the braided line 2 experimental bites, declared it uninteresting, and promptly fell asleep with his chin on it, as if guarding boredom itself. Mech climbed the toolbox, looked Merrick directly in the eye as if submitting a request in triplicate, and made a small, very serious sound. Merrick translated it as an inquiry about enemy casualties and the status of snacks. Diversion succeeded, he said, easing the throttle back to motion. Snack negotiations ongoing. They slipped the pillar field and found a trough between 2 low hills where the wind forgot for a minute what knives were. The crawler rode smoother there, the engine's tone settling into its good work voice. On the horizon, the soot smears veered again, doubling back sooner than he liked. Raiders learn, badly but fast, and the storm was honest enough now to show them where its honesty stopped. He put a hand on the dash. "All right then," he said, And the old machine answered in the only language it had: steadiness. He had 3 advantages and 4 problems. The advantages were mass, knowledge of the ground, and a pair of shaped sonic charges he'd kept under the seat since the summer he'd been talked into helping a survey crew nudge a cornice above a blocked pass. The problems were weather that had not signed any contracts with him, a brace on a wing that would not enjoy hard jolts, raiders with a spotlight that was getting far too curious about the crawler's tail, and the moral mathematics of triggering snow on living things, even if those living things were presently pointing guns at his future. He chose the canyon because the canyon had already decided what it wanted to be. Its walls leaned together like advice, its floor braided in 3 channels, where old meltwater had hesitated, then chosen. Snow settled on those braids and pillows that pretended to be deep, but were actually shallow shelves balanced on glass. Avalanches are not chaos. They are persuasion turned loud. He eased the crawler into the center braid and let it roll, slow enough that the engine sounded like a cat trying not to wake its household. The first spotlight swipe found them and skittered on. The second held longer, white on white, a wash of glare that made even the snow seem embarrassed. Mech answered with a ferocious squeak, muffled by an armful of hose. Thessera did not lift her head. She shifted her weight a fraction toward the wall on Merrick's side, as if willing the canyon narrower to cover them better. He took the hint and brought the crawler closer to the right-hand slope, so close that the treads whispered old stories to the ice. He popped the hatch in the cab roof, slid up into the cold, and braced his knees against the seat as he leaned out with the first charge. Sonic charges are more precise than people expect. They don't blow like fireworks. They hum a note Snow understands. He had 2 flat discs with adhesive backs, and a dial he could set with a gloved thumb to decide how hard, how long, and at what frequency the world should listen. He chose a spot where a wind-carved fin of snow overhung the canyon by a narrow neck, and another where a flock of cornices had accrued over a rock shelf like too much icing on a bad cake. He slapped the discs into place, with an intimacy that would have been unnerving if the objects had souls, checked the LED on each with a squint, set the timers with an old pianist's touch, and dropped back into the cab just as the third sweep of the spotlight pinned the crawler long enough to be an intention. "Count with me," he said, and he was not sure whether he was talking to Thessera, the hatchlings, the engine, or the thin rope that ran through his chest from this moment to the next. 1, 2, 3. The first charge sang. The fin didn't explode. It sighed. The whole slab settled a fraction, broke the thin bonds that had been holding it in a geometry it did not enjoy, and slid into air. Snow is heavy even when it looks like light. It hit the canyon floor in a soft detonation that burped powder up the walls and forward down the braid toward the crawler like a low, eager dog. He had already gunned the engine. Not a panicked shove, but a decisive ask, treads biting into the rim of firmer ice he had scouted earlier when he'd driven the canyon last month because he liked how it sounded. The crawler lurched, climbed the little lip, and shouldered into the left-hand braid, just as the White River filled the center in a bloom that erased line and edge. The raiders did not have the benefit of his map or his habit of noticing which way Snow would like to go if asked nicely. They rode the center line because it was obvious, and obvious is a collector of men. The powder rolled down on them in a tone that wasn't angry so much as inevitable. Their spotlight reeled skyward and then winked out as the first sled buried its own hood. The second tried to zig, and discovered zigging is more philosophy than physics under a moving load. The third slewed broadside, showed its driver a view of his own choices, and settled crooked with its nose politely tucked into the bank. The second charge sang. It had been aimed at the cornices above the left-hand braid, the one he'd just taken. A stupid move, if he'd intended to stay there. But the second disc was not for obstruction. It was for choreography. The cornices kissed their rock, decided it was not true love, broke, and slid in a white curtain that fell behind the crawler like a drawn stage drop. Powder rushed the red taillight and turned it pink, then rose and folded over where his treads had been 2 breaths earlier. The sound was like a library asking for quiet with conviction. Merrick did not cheer. He did not look back long. He spared a glance enough to see helmets bobbing in the white, arms flailing in the way of people who would have a bad day but likely not a last one, and felt the sum in his chest balance closer to right. He offered the canyon a thank you it could not hear, and rode the crawler forward into thinner snow and a bend where the wind had kept the floor scoured to blue. Inside the bay, the hatchlings had become very round. Fear plus warmth equal meatballs, and Kiri was the roundest, a small pearl with eyes. Tovan had positioned himself between his siblings and the direction of the racket, which counted as courage despite the fact that his tail was hidden under his own chin. Mech stood on the toolbox with all 4 feet, because even tiny generals know the importance of a stable firing platform. Thessera had not moved much. She had braced when the first slide hit, spreading just enough to make the sling a cradle against which the world could shove without dislodging treasure. Now she lowered her head, exhaled, and sent a rumble along the deck that found the bolts and told them what being steadfast sounded like. The canyon opened ahead into a spill of wind-scoured flats, the kind of place where visibility returns suddenly and makes you feel like you have become a better person when really the world has just been kind for a minute. Merrick let the crawler slow to honest, checked gauges, listened to the engine for any new complaints, and sent a glance back through the porthole. That was not a question. Thessera answered with a look that was not a shrug but carried the same meaning. We are here, we continue. The brace held. The gel seam along her membrane had not cracked. He felt the tiny impulse to tap the dash in celebration and restrained it. Superstition is a kind of fuel best used sparingly. Behind them, the storm tried one last affront and then went to sulk elsewhere. Ahead, the low hills he favored rose like the backs of sleeping animals. Between them, the route to the hangar threaded white and blue and a memory of summer trapped under all that cold. He eased the throttle, hummed because the room expected it, and let the mathematics of snow become history, while the arithmetic of heat and distance did its quiet, reliable work. The hangar door fought him like a hinge with opinions, but the pry bar and a shove made of stubborn lineage settled the argument. Warmth rolled out in a wave of machine breath and oil memory, and for a moment Merrick just stood in it, boots leaking meltwater, lungs relearning what air felt like when it wasn't trying to be a weapon. He backed the crawler in, killed the engine with a pat that was not quite gratitude and not quite truce, and turned the cargo bay into a receiving room. He had built this place out of jobs that didn't quite pay and parts that didn't quite fit. Turbines scrounged from a collapsed weather farm thumped along the back wall, pushing air through ductwork he'd folded like origami out of heater cowls. A gantry crane creaked overhead with the dignity of an elder. Against one wall, the printer. Squatted in its heated box like a patient animal, its filament reels labeled in his tight hand. Carbon weave, Kevlar blend, living hinge. He had meant to print a bracket for the crawler's rear suspension, a cup holder he could never justify. 100 small comforts put off by larger urgencies. Today, the cue changed. He turned the space into a habitat with the speed of a man who had updated rooms between breaths before. First, hot floors. He bled a loop from the turbine coolant into coils under the grating and watched the frost evaporate in a shy shiver, leaving metal that remembered being warm. He hauled 2 pallets of wool felt he'd once bought from a failed textile dome and laid them over the grating to make a soft peninsula next to the crawler. Thessera's talons clicked onto it and stopped clicking. Some kinds of gratitude wear the face of simple relief. He rolled out a drum of water he kept against the back wall, fed a hose through the inline heater he'd welded, together from an espresso boiler and a farm pump, and let steam curl into the air with the smell of iron and something like hope. Then, the wing. The field brace he'd built in the crawler had done what first drafts do, held until better arrived. He photographed the geometry, marked where the gel seam had taken and where the membrane still argued, and fed the measurements into the printer with the keen focus of a man solving a puzzle whose pieces could bleed. The design grew on the screen as his hands moved on the keyboard like he was tuning an engine with a song in it. A lightweight lattice arced across the torn span, ribs braided with shock cords to flex with the living motion beneath. He added mounting pads contoured to scale, micro-textured so they would grip without biting. He set the printhead to lay down carbon and Kevlar in alternating bias, then hit start and listened to the first whispers of filament becoming future. While the machine wrote patience into plastic, he cleaned the wound, as if it were a friend at his table. The medgel had warmed the tissue back to a color that said circulation remembered its routes. He flushed the edges with saline warm to body, blotted gently, and regelled the stubborn pales where frost had licked deepest. Thessera watched him with one eye the size of his open hand. When his fingers strayed too near a nerve line, she made a sound like a string being tuned, and he adjusted pressure as if she'd spoken in his own language, and it would have been rude to pretend he hadn't understood. Feeding the small ones took an art he had not planned to need, but found in himself anyway. He built them bowls out of cut-down coolant funnels, mixed a broth of concentrated protein, mineral salts, a sliver of rendered fat he shaved from a block meant for gearboxes, and enough hot water to make it steam. Kiri approached first, polite as a guest. Tovan eyed the operation like a foreman, decided it passed inspection, and ate with sincere purpose. Mech threw his head back, hissed at the steam as if daring it to be hotter, and then plunged in until his chin looked like he'd lost a fight with a very small volcano. Merrick laughed and wiped him with an old shop rag that had once belonged to his father. Somewhere in the rag's fading stripes, the room remembered kitchens and long, forgiving afternoons. The printer sang its steady insect hymn. He took the downtime to check Thessara's respiration and found it slower now, deep where it had been shallow, regular where it had been ragged. He cleaned the salt crust from her nostrils, removed ice splinters that had lodged like cruel punctuation along the leading edge of her wing, and massaged the muscles between her shoulder and breastbone until he felt a tremor unlock. She rewarded him with a rumble that moved through the floor and up his shins and settled in his chest like a second heartbeat, and for a moment the hanger was a bell and they were both the clapper. Trouble rarely forgets addresses. He knew that. So while heat spread and hunger quieted, he secured doors and appetites alike. He put the outer blast door on manual so no unexpected electricity could gift raiders a handle. He wired the side vents to a pair of throttles he set on the workbench, labeled in grease pencil, north throw, west throw. He filled the grit hopper on the roof with screened ice pellets the size of lentils. Under turbine speed, those pellets became weather with opinions. He calibrated the old comms jammer he'd salvaged from a mining union he'd once helped keep private, tuned it to the raiders' favorite bands, and left it asleep with one eye open. He tested the emergency det cord he'd laid along the doorframe in a pattern that wouldn't kill anyone but would make sparks think twice about staying lit. The printer finished with a chirp that sounded apologetic for having kept them waiting. The brace sat on the platen still warm, a black arc of intention with that silver-threaded cords hanging slack like the strings of an instrument not yet tuned. He brought it to Thessara like an offering, laid it on the felt within reach, and let her inspect it. She nosed the lattice, sniffed the mounting pads, breathed on the cords until their tiny metal crimps clicked as they warmed. He waited for the slow blink that meant proceed. It came, and he moved. Fitting it took the better part of an hour, and all the patience in his pockets. He slid the pads under the outer edge of the membrane one by one, checking for pressure points with his fingertips and then with the gentler test of his cheek. He ran the cords through their anchors and tightened them in a sequence that made the lattice share load like a good team. Twice he loosened and relayed when Thessara's shoulder rolled and the gel seam complained. The third time the brace settled as if it had been born to her, and the membrane lay smooth, a careful geometry catching the light. He could almost hear the numbers purr. When he clipped the last cord, Kiri chirped as if to mark the moment. Tovan brought him the rag again, a gift from a prince. Mech bit the air where the printer had been, declared victory, and fell asleep sitting up like a soldier who had lost an argument with comfort. Merrick sat back on his heels and let the ache in his hands announce itself. He flexed each finger, found all of them present, and gave the room a grin he would have denied if asked. Night pressed its ear to the door and listened for weakness. The turbines breathed. The thermometer nailed to the pillar next to the workbench, climbed past, survivable toward kind. Merrick brewed himself a cup of tea that tasted faintly of whatever the hose had last carried, and watched steam rise into lamplight while he made a list in his head of the things he would not forget to do in the morning. He reached absent-mindedly to scratch the scuffed paint on the bench where, years ago, he'd carved a small constellation during another long night. When he looked up, Thessera was watching him, He touched the constellation, then tapped his chest. Home, he said. Not because they were yet, but because he'd chosen that word for the direction they were now aimed. The first hint of trouble arrived as a shiver along the gantry rail and a thin, unhappy flicker in the pressure readouts on the outer door. It took a second to separate it from the turbine's heartbeat and the dragon's hum. Then a second, more to accept that the storm had brought company with hands. He set the cup down, throttled the turbines up 2 notches until the ductwork sang, and went to the bench to wake the switches that would tell the weather how to help him hold his ground. They came like men who believed doors owed them something. The first wink of a cutter licked along the seam of the outer gate, orange teeth gnawing at cold steel. It made a pretty shower that hissed out in the spill of wind from the roof vents. Sparks do not live long in a room where the air itself has an argument to make. Merrick flipped the north throw throttle, and the duct above the door exhaled a sheet of sharpened air. Ice pellets screamed into the night, invisible and very convincing. The cutter's flame guttered, stuttered, and then vanished as whoever held it swore in a language that only ever sounds elegant when nobody is using it to take things that are not theirs. Thesara's head rose. Every line of her had changed since the crevasse. The brace held her wing at a confident arc. The membrane under it was a healed map with roads still repaving. She did not lunge, because mothers do not waste motion when children are near. She did unfold the uninjured wing until it made a roof over the felt peninsula, bringing the warm underside down like a sheltering sky. Kiri slid under that roof with the speed of a thought. Tovin followed with the dignity of a junior officer carrying the very important rag. Mech stood in the gap. A heartbeat, longer than wisdom recommends, met Merrick's eye through the porthole and stepped backward into safety with a nod that was somehow both defiant and wise. The raiders adjusted. They always do, because the world indulges mediocrity with second chances. The cutter went quiet. Boots squelched in churned snow. Somebody set a charge with the caution of a man who had once blown his eyebrows off and intended never to repeat the experience. Merrick heard tape peel, a timer whisper. Men step back and hold their breath. He clicked the jammer alive, a low smudge across the comms band that turned hand signals into the only reliable language outside and fed the turbines another measure of anger. The vents blew a crosswind that was almost a gale. Snow lifted off the flats in a dragonback ripple, and the world just outside the door became a blender you could not see into. The charge thumped. The door did not move. He had set the det cord in a lazy S along the interior seam for exactly this. Moment the outer skin shivered, the inner frame flexed, and the energy dispersed into the skeleton of the hangar like rain into a thirsty field. A cheer tried to start outside and died confused when the panel stayed panel-shaped. Someone hit the door with something heavy in an effort both admirable and hilariously ineffective. He let them have their moment. He could have sat there and played turtle until the storm got bored, and the men did too. But boredom is a luxury, and hunger is punctual, and Thesara did not need a siege with hatchlings learning new kinds of fear as a memory they would carry. He preferred lessons he chose. He switched the vents from steady to pulse. The turbines wound up to hurricane and then fell to hard gusts and then surged again, the intervals uneven, the way a predator breathes when it has remembered how fun running can be. Between pulses, he slid to the side bay hatch, threw it open a crack, and emptied a bucket of his grit mix into the throat of the wind. The next pulse took those microneedles like a choir takes harmony and flung them sideways in a curving stream that whistled when it left and hissed when it hit. The men outside found themselves in weather that made new rules without asking them first. Cutters wouldn't stay lit. Goggles took sandblasting they hadn't paid for. The hose on someone's fuel cell cracked like old varnish under the assault, and the smell of released propane made an anxious ribbon through the air. A voice commanding, trying to be steady and succeeding better than most, called for a regroup. Merrick filed the voice away. He had a talent for voices. He had other toys. Along the ceiling, above the old ventilation louvers, he'd mounted a ring of passive resonators he had told himself were there to break up turbine harmonics and keep the neighbors he did not have from getting headaches. He pulled a panel off the wall and slid a finger up the dimmer tied into those coils until the metal hummed at a frequency that made the hair on his arms stand up. Snow is a listener. Certain notes make it let go of itself. Not avalanche loud, and not enough to scour the flats. just enough to lift loose powder in a lace that floated into the vent stream and turned the air in front of the door into a live veil. Men walked into that veil and came back out spitting and coughing, their courage mistaken for appetite in a storm they couldn't bite. A bang hit the side wall, a sled, misjudging in low visibility, kissing the hanger with the kind of enthusiasm only expensive repairs cure. He toggled the jammer off and on in a rhythm that sounded like interference but was, in fact, a simple sentence sent 3 times on 3 bands. "You are out of your depth." The commanding voice swore, shorter now, clipped, then called for a torch on the west corner. Merrick smiled without joy and cranked the west throw throttle. The vent there coughed a long lungful of refrozen grauple and a blizzard of needle ice that came off the roof like a tilted river. The torch died before it cleared its holster. He felt eyes on him and turned. Through the porthole, Thesera watched with the unblinking attention of a creature who has practiced patience for more lifetimes than his species had even named. The brace held, cords gleaming when the lamplight caught them. She lowered her head until the golden eye filled the little window. He didn't need translation for this one either. "Do what you are good at," the look said. "I will do the same." He opened the main door, 2 hands, and no more. Cold punched through the gap like a thief. So did the sound, the layered, ragged chorus of men breathing hard and trying to make their determined hearts louder than their complaining bodies. The pulse wind from the vents curled around Merrick like a tame thing and then left him to do its rough work outside. He stepped into the mouth of the gap with his torque wrench in one hand and a length of insulated cable in the other, like a man who had decided impotence was optional. The raider at the front was in a powered exo, all plated angles and blinking status, the sort of suit that sells itself with words like dominance and survivability to men who like the way things feel when they press. The coil gun bolted to its forearm gleamed with a recent polish that made Merrick's teeth itch. The man lifted the gun. The pulse wind hit him sideways and set his stance to drunk. "You don't want this," Merrick said, voice low, "because low carries better in weather." The coil whined. "You really don't." The golden streak of Thesera's breath licked the snow outside the gap and turned a neat line into black glass. It did not touch the man. It drew an underline the length of his suit's shadow. Heat found his sensors and made them tell him conflicting stories. The exo hesitated the way people do when their gear goes from friend to liar. Merrick stepped in, caught the coil gun housing with the insulated cable loop, twisted and yanked. Momentum and design did the rest. The weapon slewed harmlessly into the door jamb and stuck there as the magnetic locking plate in the frame made friends with its barrel. The exo's servos fought the magnet and lost. The man inside swore, grabbed for a manual release, and found Merrick's torque wrench in his way. Not striking, blocking, redirecting, nudging the suit's elbow joint into a lock position that most manuals don't discuss because most manuals assume you aren't fighting a mechanic who has spent years teaching joints how to behave. "Back," Merrick said, and for a heartbeat, the voice that came out of him was the one that had told engines to live and families of parts to remember they were, in fact, a family. The man heard it where he could hear nothing else, and took a step he would later call tactical, another he might call prudence, and then a third he would never tell a story about. The line of men beyond him reshaped, like snow squalls do when the wind changes direction without announcing why. Merrick closed the door to a fist's width. The turbines kept singing. The vents kept throwing. He shut the jammer off entirely and let the open air fill with words. The commanding voice came again, tight and angry, but not foolish. "We go," it said, "and if you have ever heard a man lay his failure down without setting it on fire first, you know the sound." Boots retreated. One sled engine caught. Another coughed. A third wouldn't cooperate, because machines do what they want when they have been insulted. After a while, the only noises left were the turbines, the wind, and the small, exhausted sounds families make when adrenaline leaves the room. He opened the door all the way to wash the threshold with clean air, and let the night see that it could go be dramatic somewhere else. The stars above the storm were cruelly bright, the kind that make you remember your life as a small, warm room in a very large, cold house. He shut the door again, barred it, and leaned his forehead against the metal that had earned a little respect. Inside, Thessera lowered her wing and let the warmth back where it had been. The hatchlings poured out, with the self-importance of diplomats arriving after a crisis, sniffed the air, and decided it all smelled appropriately heroic. Mech climbed the toolbox, tilted his head at Merrick with the air of a commander evaluating a promising junior, and allowed one tiny chirp that meant continue. Merrick sat on the felt and let his back find the broad curve of Thessera's shoulder. He could feel the brace transmit her breath into his spine. A gentle, even rise that matched the pulse in his wrists, until two bodies of different histories shared one metronome. He took stock with his hands the way mechanics do. Doors intact, turbines enthusiastic, vents smug, printer content, hatchlings fed, wing secure, man tired. He thought of the valley on the map where Steam wrote, "Kindness on the ice," and pictured it not as an escape now, but as a destination befitting a family. Tomorrow, he said into the warm air, and if the word carried further than the hangar walls, he wouldn't be surprised. Thessera answered with that bell-deep note he had learned, and the turbines, finally, relaxed their song to something that sounded like sleep preparing to happen. Outside, the storm kept its gossip to itself. Inside, heat held, and the night learned a different story than the one it had planned to tell. Dawn tried the latch on the world and found it still sticky with night. The storm had moved off in a sulk, leaving the hangar under a sky hard as hammered glass. Merrick walked the perimeter with a mug he hadn't finished, steam ghosting his face, torque wrench hanging from his belt the way other men wear sidearms. The turbines idled low. Inside, the hatchlings were a warm heap of improbable geometry, and Thessera lay in a curve that put her eye toward the door, and her wing his brace, at an angle that said ready without wasting a single motion on showing off. The muffled thrum came a heartbeat before the dust, a sled limping in with the stubbornness of bad ideas. Not a squad, just one, its engine doing the old cough and brag while its rider sat taller than his exhaustion justified. He wore an exo that had seen a catalog more recently than a maintenance bench, plates polished, status lights blinking their own private optimism. The coil gun bolted to his forearm was the costly kind, the kind that says, "I bring perspectives to a conversation." The visor mirrored the hangar mouth until he flipped it up. Under it was a square face that had the same look Merrick had seen on the hinges of the old door. Surprised anything would resist him long enough to need a second try, he dismounted, boots punching little commas into the crusted snow. No cutters, no chorus. A single man with a heavy letter he'd decided to deliver personally. Merrick opened the door a hand's breadth and let the cold make its argument before he did. "Morning," he said. "You cost me equipment and time." The voice had the sanded-down edges of command, the kind that gets taught in rooms with diagrams. He cocked a thumb toward the sled, as if receipts could be demanded from weather. "I've got men to answer to." "You've also got eyebrows," Merrick said mildly. "Today." He let the gap widen until wind shouldered in and tried to nose past him. He set one foot, and the wind changed its mind. "If you came for a fight, you brought the wrong day. If you came for your boys," they're behind that bend, digging themselves philosophical. The man's eyes flicked past the crack toward the warmth that breathed out of it. He saw the felt peninsula, the coil of steam, a glint of carbon lattice on a living wing. He blinked. "You're keeping it." Her. Merrick's hand found the insulated cable loop he'd tucked behind the jam, swung it casually as if it were a length of rope from a porch on a summer planet. "And, no, I'm keeping promises." "There's a difference." The coil gun lifted a fraction on the exo's servo. Thessera did not lunge. She leaned the smallest shift, and the golden seam of her breath wrote a line along the snow between them that turned white to glass, a neat underline precise enough to belong in an engineer's notebook. The coil gun's targeting winked as heat made it lie to its owner. The man hesitated, not for morality's sake, but because experience had finally tripped him by the ankle, and he had paused to see what he'd fallen over. Merrick stepped into the gap, torque wrench in one hand, cable in the other. Not aggressive, just present in the way a wall decides to be there when you want a door. "You know the suit better than the machine shop that made it?" he asked conversationally. "I know enough." "That," Merrick said, "is what breaks things." He moved, and movement is a vocabulary. When you live with machines, the cable loop kissed the coil gun's barrel and the door frame at the same time. The magnet plate behind the jam woke like a dog, hearing its name, and took hold. The Exo hissed a question to itself and answered by locking the wrist to the frame's new best friend. The man swore and reached for the quick release on the elbow. Merrick's wrench arrived first and turned a gesture into a geometry. The suit froze in a posture known in many cultures as reconsideration. "We can escalate," Merrick said. "Calm the way a dial is calm when it has numbers above the one you've set. Or we can demonstrate." He tapped the Exo's side panel twice with the heel of his hand, found the maintenance access by feel because all suits share the same sins, popped it, and slid 2 fingers under a bundle of neatly routed arrogance. He pinched the primary coil feed and the secondary servo supply together just long enough for the suit to learn humility. Lights dimmed. The coil gun whined down. A diagnostic tone, embarrassed, cleared its throat. The man inside the armor looked human again in the half-second when power sagged. He stared at Merrick. He stared past him at the warm dark where a dragon breathed and 3 small shapes slept. Something old moved behind his features, a calculation that wasn't about profit. "Why?" he said. And it wasn't the why of paperwork. "Because if I do nothing, 4 lives end," Merrick said. "Because if I hand them to you, 5 do. Because I fix things. This," he added with a nod at the coil gun, "is not a thing." Silence tried on the space between them. The wind failed to fill it. The suit's status lights came back to themselves one by one. Chagrined, the man exhaled. He looked at the glass line on the snow, and at the torque wrench that had not struck him, and at the way Merrick's shoulder set when he said fix. "I can say I found nothing," he said slowly, like a person testing the weight of a new tool. "I can say the storm took the sled and the tracks. I can say my men were lucky." "You can," Merrick agreed. "And you can sleep." He reached and unhooked the cable loop. The magnet let go, like a friend who knows you'll be back. He nudged the gun aside with the wrench and closed the panel on the Exo's hip as if he were tucking in a child. "There's a basin east where the wind's wrong for engines," he added. "Don't go there. It remembers." The man's mouth tugged. Not quite a smile. "You're not from here. I am now." Merrick extended his hand because he wanted the shape of the ending to be chosen. After a long second, gloved metal met glove. The pressure was brief and awkward and somehow correct. He left the man to his sled and the sled to its repentant cough and watched them thread back into the white. When he shut the door, Thisara was still watching. He crossed the felt, set the wrench on the felt bench, and stood where her head could reach him if she chose. She did not hesitate. The great skull lowered, the brow ridge brushed his shoulder, and the weight of that touch landed in him like a verdict he wanted. Heat soaked his coat where scale met fabric. The sound she made next wasn't the lullaby or the battle hum. It was the note rooms make when oaths are spoken and meant. He didn't know the word, he knew its translation anyway. He set his palm against her jaw, feeling the living engine under the plates. "Then it's written," he said. "Your little ones go where steam makes spring out of winter. Your wing flies. I take you there. We keep each other breathing." Behind him, a small throat cleared with exaggerated decorum. Mech had climbed the toolbox and was staring not at the giant oath happening, but at the cupboard where Merrick kept the meal packets. The mechanic laughed once, startled and easy. A man whose house had decided to multiply. He fed them. He tightened the brace one more notch, while the gel steamed gently. He checked the turbines, and the roof vents, and the old jammer that had become unnecessary in a world that had just learned a better rule. Dawn finished its work on the latch. Light found the window, and the day he'd promised them began. The sky took off its iron and put on blue. Frost turned to diamonds along the hangar roof, and then to water that ran in little thoughtful streams down the seams and into the thirsty ground. Merrick drank a second cup of tea that tasted, miraculously, like tea. He printed 2 more lattice ribs and a set of soft mount straps to replace the field webbing, then did the fitting with the kind of fussy care that makes outsiders say perfectionist and machines say thank you. Thessera flexed slowly, testing each chord the way a violinist tests a new string. The brace sang back in little unsounded notes that he felt rather than heard. The membrane took sunlight without flinching. Transport needed solving. He had no interest in making the hatchlings learn flight in a headwind for his convenience. He dragged the shop toboggan from under the gantry, a sheet of low-friction composite with corners rounded by years of unreasonable requests, and bolted high sides to it so small explorers would not convert it into a science project. About momentum. He lined it with felt, hooked it into the crawler's pintle with a shock-absorbing coupler he'd stolen from a broadcast mast, and added a canopy of mesh to keep curiosity from trying wind at 40 kilometers an hour. Curie sniffed it like a princess sampling a new province. Tovan tapped each bolt head with his nose and seemed to approve the torque settings. Mech clambered aboard, sat very straight, and announced a policy that the others obeyed immediately. This was a ship he built for himself, a different answer. Saddle was too grand a word for the thing. He assembled a padded plate that strapped to the ridge where Thessara's shoulders met. With 3 anchor points and a quick release, he could work blind, but he liked how the word felt in his mouth, even if he never said it out loud. He brought it to her, with the same ceremony he'd given the brace. She studied it with deliberate attention and then bent her neck to lower the ridge into his hands, a trust so clean it made his chest ache. He cinched the girth under her, checked for pinch, checked again because men who fall forget to check, and then stood with both hands on warm scale while she rose to her full height, and the room remembered what the word vast was for. He didn't mount like the heroes in stories, who vault and land grinning. He climbed like a patient man who knows what bones are for and what they cost. 1 boot to the bracket, 1 knee, 1 careful swing, then a slow settle into the curve the saddle wanted him in. He clipped into the forward anchor and the side line, kept the rear line loose so he could move with her, and breathed until his breath matched hers. The view shifted from mechanic's eye line to cathedral, hangar turned nave, turbines in their housings, like organs in a rib cage. He put a palm flat against her. If either of us doesn't like the idea, he murmured, we change it. She liked the idea. The roll of her shoulders lifted him with the tidal surety of an animal making a decision it had made 1,000 times in other seasons. He felt every instruction the circuitry of the brace delivered, and every instruction her nerves returned. He signaled with a lean and a palm and a soft cluck he wasn't aware he'd borrowed from beasts common to friendlier worlds. They walked the length of the hangar once, twice, learning each other's center of gravity. Curie ran at their side, tripping over her own feet and inventing a new gait she had the nerve to call running. Tovan herded nothing at all, chest puffed out with holy purpose. Mech, caught between wanting to ride the toboggan and wanting to be first at everything, chose to stand on the prow like a captain carving a future from air. Merrick opened the hangar door with 2 hands and a ceremonial slowness that made a new room out of dawn. The storm was a story told elsewhere now. Wind walked the flats with its hat in its hands. Steam from distant vents wrote faint punctuation on the horizon like a map annotating itself. He led the crawler out, the toboggan following with an obedient tug, the hatchlings formalizing their arrangement into nap, inquiry, and command. He turned the turbines down to a hum so the air outside could hear another music. Thessara stepped into the light. Her shadow stretched over the snow and over the sled's carved path and over the small smears of history men had left the night before, replacing them with a geometry nobody could misinterpret. She crouched just enough to ask. Merrick checked the anchors, found them as he'd left them because good work stays good, and patted her scale. We try small, he said. We try close. And if the ground disagrees, we buy at lunch. She answered with a note he had learned to take as assent, tucked her forelimbs, threw heat into her chest for lift, and unfurled both wings. The one with the brace moved like a part of her that had learned calculus, the other like a poem returning to rhyme. Snow leapt away from the downdraft, and then settled back in an amended opinion. She bounded once, twice, and then the third stride didn't land. Weight became suggestion. Air became road. They didn't climb. He didn't need that, and she didn't know it. They skimmed the flats at a height a tall man could have grazed with his fingertips, and the ground hurried by under them in a rush that made his ears pop and his heart go very quiet. The toboggan line went slack and then taut again as the crawler adjusted to keep the hatchlings in the wind shadow he chose for them, the little faces at the mesh, blinking as the world changed what fast meant. Merrick leaned with her over, a hummocked blue, and felt the brace take a portion of the strain and hand it back as comfort. He kissed his teeth in admiration, because sometimes that's how awe exits a man's mouth. A small updraft lifted them clean over a drift he'd meant to steer around. He shifted with her. She compensated like a dancer checking a partner's intention. For a heartbeat, the entire morning fit inside the cupped palm of that glide shop rag memories and cherry scent gel and torque settings and lullabies and snow that had learned better manners. He heard himself laugh the way he'd laughed when Mech first tried to bite light. Thessera rumbled once, the sound you make when you agree with joy. They sat down not because they had to, but because the route loved their feet too. The crawler hummed its satisfaction and resumed the lead. Steam on the horizon thickened from annotation to paragraph as they approached the valley Merrick had marked on quiet nights. The lip of it came up like the rim of a bowl someone had cupped in their hands and warmed for years. He parked the crawler at the crest and stepped down into air that didn't hurt to breathe. Below lay a spill of terraces chiseled by time and gentled by heat. Pools smoked in pale veils. The stone around them gleamed dark with minerals. Ice hung back at the edges, like a patient audience that knew when to let the performers have the stage. He could feel the ground's temperature through his boots, and through the place in his chest where anxiety had been living rent-free for too long. Thessera leaned over the lip and exhaled. Steam answered with a hiss that sounded, if you were reckless enough to translate geology, like welcome. They took the slope in 3 motions. Crawler slow and proud, toboggan sensibly smug, dragonlight on her feet because she could be. At the first pool, the air smelled of iron and salt and something sweet he couldn't name. He unhooked the toboggan. Kiri hopped down like a pilgrim touching holy. Dares, Tovin, whose responsibilities had weighed heavily on him for almost 20 minutes, staggered to the water's edge and discovered that warmth can undo valor faster than any enemy. He folded in half and fell asleep with his nose on a mossy lip. Mech marched to the same lip, took a ceremonial sip as if judging a vintage, and nodded once with the gravity of a creature who would be a terror at tastings. Merrick shed his gloves and knelt at Thessara's side. He loosened the brace's tension 2 notches, to account for heat expansion, and the forgiveness water would lend. He checked gel lines that had become mere memory. He ran his palm along the membrane and felt the difference between yesterday and now. She eased forward into the pool 1 limb at a time, lowering her weight until buoyancy took some of the story and told it kindly. When the brace submerged, he held his breath without meaning to, and then let it go when the chords held their song. Water steamed around the lattice and turned the air into a room even the storm would have enjoyed if storms were capable of shame. He sat on warm stone with his boots off and his trousers rolled, ankles in water that convinced him he might in fact have a future. The hatchlings discovered that feet can be used as paddles and as excuses to splash their siblings. Kiri chased a bubble with the single-minded heroism of someone inventing purpose. Tovin declared a small shelf his personal island and defended it from nobody with vigor. Mech found the place where the overflow poured down to the next terrace and stood in it, like a statue of a general who had finally found an enemy worthy of him. Gravity. Thessera lowered her head until the golden eye was level with Merrick's and close enough to show him his own reflection, rumpled, unshaven, suddenly and inexplicably certain. She breathed out. He breathed in. The note she gave him was not a lullaby and not a battle hymn. It was clean and simple and new, built on the old ones, and made for mornings that have more room in them than nights can imagine. He nodded once because anything more would have spilled it. He did, because he is a mechanic, and that means you measure even joy. Check the lines he'd run to keep the crawler's coolant loop from sulking in lower gravity, retightened a clamp that had thought about democracy, refueled from the drum, whose contents had finally found a story worthy of them, and, because he could not help himself, staked a small marker by the trail with 3 letters stamped into it, with the tail end of a wrench, HG1, home, first of several. When the sun slanted and the terraces glowed like coins on blue velvet, Thesera rose from the pool without strain. She raised her wings to dry them, and the brace made a pattern of shadow on the stone, like a net holding nothing but air. Kiri climbed Merrick's knee to see what the world looked like from this important elevation. Tovin dragged the rag to a spot he decided was ceremonial, and napped exactly there. Mech discovered Merrick's boot and declared it annexed by standing in it. Merrick laughed again, the tiredness leaving his bones as if it had found a better house. He looked up at the cliff face, where icicles watched like solemn candle flames, and at the strip of sky so blue it felt engineered. He thought of the man in the exo riding back to his own weather, and of the hinges on the door that would need grease, and of the list on the bench that had sprouted a new line in a new hand. He put his palm against warm scale and said the only plan that mattered, and it wasn't even a plan so much as a grammar. "We stay," he told the valley. The dragon, the small diplomats, the old machine humming on the ridge, and the idea took the shape of a future with the same patient speed as filament cooling into something strong.